Do we need to ask for public comment?
Sure, we do have a member of the public on Zoom and in person.
Okay, have a comment in person.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question about protocol. Three meetings ago, the committee recommended that the parking lot wasn't needed. But then, I guess during the site visit, Scott came up to Ken and said, "Oh, I should be back in." But there was no committee discussion about that.
Yeah, I'm not, if I remember correctly, like, we didn't vote to exclude it at any time.
The parking lot?
Yeah, I'm not, and I think based on what Scott, or maybe it was Alex that was saying that, that could be a decision that's made by the planning commission.
Scott wasn't at the last meeting.
Yeah, so it must have been
Yeah.
Alex that made that
Right,
comment.
yeah, it must have been.
It was our choice to put it back in, and we
Right.
chose to put it back in.
Yeah, I don't feel like we've had any kind of lengthy discussion about that. Maybe it isn't really our place even. Maybe, we could leave it in and let the planning commission make a decision.
Yeah, I think when we transmit to the planning commission, that could be one of the things that you could have as a bullet point. What are your thoughts on this? It's not required for the growth management score. It would be nice to provide up public access to that part of the path and part of the view.
Right,
But it's ultimately up to the planning commission to decide.
because there are different viewpoints. Like, I feel it's necessary, because I live near one of those access points, and it's constantly, the parking lot is full. And I think it would be, it might exclude some people using it if they couldn't park there. So I don't know when we want to have it, if we want to have a discussion or when.
The minutes from last time, Alex stated the DRB will ultimately decide whether
Yeah.
it stays or go. And I think that was sort of the conclusion of the discussion last week. So we said it's conceptual, and at this point, we don't really have discretion to make a decision on it, was how I felt it was explained. Is that fair?
Yeah,
I do think, though, that as part of the charge of the planning commission, I think we are in a position to make those recommendations moving forward.
Mhm.
If indeed we're preserving the scenic view without any impediment. So then, to me, it's counterproductive to have the first 12 cars of the day to be able to park there. And the spillover of that, can they park then in the neighborhood where you could see that in other access points, to where they would just park just so they can do the path. So are we being exclusive? And we have those 12 spots, but it defeats the purpose of the scenic view,
Right, and I think ultimately that's gonna be a question for, like, when this land comes into the town's ownership, how the town wants to manage it and provide access. Ultimately, we can't require that parking lot through the bylaws, because we don't have a parking space requirement. If you're building a multi-use path, you must also put in a parking lot. Houses are required to have parking. They're meeting their growth management criteria next to the community building or the neighborhood building for the neighborhood. But if the applicant wants to willingly provide that, that's fine. It's not something we can outright require through bylaw enforcement. If it's something that the planning commission and that the applicant feel mutually agreeable on and showing the site plan, there could be a notation added to it, said that if this parking lot's constructed, do so in a way that reduces impervious surface and minimizes visual impact. So maybe it's a gravel lot or a seasonal grass lot versus a paved parking lot. There's a couple of those in Richmond where it's just a seasonal grassed area that's roped off. So there's a lot of different ways, but I think all those ways tend to fall outside of bylaw requirements, which the committee's focus is partially, does this project comply with the bylaws as written, or is an amendment necessary?
Just two questions. One, besides the parking lot for the view, is there any other reason why that parking lot has been proposed? Is it going to be like some sort of pickup drop-off point? Is it going to be like for a bus or something? Is that some other goal that we don't know about, or?
So it could be, as part of their growth management criteria, are you guys doing a bus shelter?
We are doing a bus shelter, yes.
Yeah, so at the discretionary permit review, that's when the applicant and DRB would decide on where is the best place for the shelter? Is it the neighborhood building? Is it Old Stage? Is it Mountain View? So that's a bit nebulous. That won't be worked out till discretionary permit.
I have the
Yeah.
other question, Mr. Glaser. So my question for you, did you envision giving that 15 acres of anything being besides a path?
I think whatever the town felt was necessary is what we thought we should have, but not a building. We didn't want a building.
Yeah, I think there are other valuable uses of a parking lot with, as a planning or on the Conservation Commission, we deal with primitive paths all the time. And that's often a really big issue is people want to use it. And if we don't provide some kind of parking in certain areas, then they either take up the road or they don't use it or they overfill other areas. So it's at least, I agree that, there's positive and negatives to providing some kind of access there and some kind of parking.
Mhm.
But as you said, we could recommend something or we could state the concerns either way, I suppose,
Mhm.
So a couple points I would make. I don't know that there's been a vote on this or on almost anything else. The best we've gotten so far are a couple of straw polls, including the last meeting where I asked if there was gonna be a vote and said, well, you could ask for a straw poll. So I don't know that there's been an official thing. We put it in because somebody else who attended one of these meetings asked it. So we put it in. It's not, we're just trying to be responsive. And as I said, the last meeting, ultimately, we would just like to know what is we're supposed to do. Because I sort of feel like we're caught in the middle. You've been advocating for your position, which is great. We've heard other voices and, so we just want to know what we're supposed to do. If the
Well,
consensus,
I guess my concern was that it was done in the meeting with the group, whereas Scott just came up to you during the parking lot should be back in, and it wasn't.
I'm not sure it was done in the group. I mean, you voiced your opinion. I mean, I never voiced my opinion at that time, and I know Conservation.
Weeks ago, when we did have the last meeting, we talked about parking lot, and then there was discussion about the credits, the transportation credits, right, is that the right term for it? And you said, well, we're doing it because we want to get the credits, and then it was decided that the parking lot around the developments community center would take care of that. So it was like, okay, we don't need it then. And that was really the motivation for having it in the first place, from what I remember you said at that meeting.
well, it was asked for by a member of the public who participated in at least one of these meetings. I remember it very clearly. And so there, at one point, it may have been a part of the consideration of our proposed growth management score. But the plan has been modified a number of different times. We had to, for example, we basically were told by the fire department, they were not gonna go for more than 40 dwelling units on a single point of access. So we made a major revision to the plan. Part of that revision, putting that horseshoe shaped road on Old Stage Road. And we had gotten commentary from the board to rework what we were doing for the neighborhood recreation area. So as a consequence of all of those things, that parking area wasn't required as part of our growth
I guess my
management.
concern, it wasn't open for discussion, because it was just commented walking around the field, and it wasn't the group.
It was our choice to put it back, and solely our choice to put it back.
Well,
Yeah.
based on what you said at the last meeting, you said Scott came up to you and said, put it back.
It's still our decision. This is all a draft
Oh, yeah,
plan.
I realize that, but I'm just saying, it seemed like it was more earlier was. seemed like-
And I would go back to what I said a moment ago, which is that it's, having been to all of these meetings, other than voting on the minutes, the committee hasn't really voted on anything. Everything has been, it's been relatively informal. There have been what we call straw polls, as a way of us kind of trying to read the temperature of the room and that sort of thing. I would just say to you, our understanding is everything here is potentially in flux. Nothing's been approved.
Right.
We're still working with the committee. And if the consensus of the committee or the planning commission or the select board or any of the other boards involved in this is like to say, take it out, that works for us. In fact, it's gonna cost us less money
Yeah.
to build out the plan. So we're just trying to be responsive, and that's it.
Just about transparency, that's all. Okay.
So I guess, will we move right to the charge to the committee to go over that again, Emily, is that?
I just linked the charge and the site plans, so you had them at your reference. I have time to do that in all the agendas. The next thing would be going over the proposed bylaw amendments.
Is that the one that says complete bylaw audit table?
Yeah, so the audit table is just a quick summary of all the chapters, and then the main chapters we work on are 11, 26, and 39. So all the, and it's impossible to see on the shared screen, so most of you have a computer in front of you. Chapters of the bylaw that aren't applicable or will comply as written are grayed out. We have a notation in chapter 11 about growth management, a chapter notation in street trees about the scenic vista, a notation in the residential zoning district that's about, the overall goal of the specific plan. And then at the end would be adding a new appendix to the bylaw, Appendix K, which would be all the documents from this process, the site plan, the minutes, the growth management questionnaire, the charge. So as the DRB is reviewing the future proposed development plans, there's any other questions, we have all of this neatly appendicized as a reference document. I'm going to start with the easiest one, street trees. So typically, street trees are required along existing and proposed streets. The DRB has an option to give an exemption where street trees, an exemption from street trees to preserve a scenic vista. So the statement would be street trees shall not be required along Mountain View Road and Old Stage Road in order to preserve the scenic vista looking east. I do also note that the street specifications or the road profiles for Mountain View and Old Stage make it very challenging as well to provide street trees. They're a ditch section. So this would be a scenario where that existing hedgerow along Old Stage Road would be remain. We're not touching it, but we wouldn't supplement in any new. And then we would require them along Mountain View Road in order to preserve that view.
So when you say shall not be required, that to me says, that means you don't have to do it, but you could. Do
Yeah,
we want to exclude them? I mean, if the purpose is to preserve the view, maybe it should be shall not be allowed rather than shall not be required. Is there a difference? Maybe I'm being too picky.
Yeah, it's a rare day when an applicant says,
I'll do it anyway.
I'm gonna do this, even though I'm not required, and we don't think people want it, but we're gonna do it anyways.
But legally you could, with the way
Well,
this is written.
So remember that part of the, so the land area in question that Emily is talking about is the 15 acres that we're offering to dedicate to
So
the
it's
town.
town land.
So it will become town land. And so should the town decide trees there make sense? And maybe it's not, a hedgerow or, a regular, street tree section that you would see on a conventional subdivision street. But it could be that there are a couple of trees here, a couple of trees there that are
Yeah.
planted to,
Could be apple trees.
Yeah,
or
smaller.
something.
versus tall, very large growing trees, yeah.
So thank you for clarifying that, Emily, because I was actually confused when I said, okay, I'm trying to imagine to preserve the scenic view, there has to be no trees along Old Stage Road. That I don't necessarily get, just because of you can still see the view even with the hedgerow there. So thank you for clarifying the difference between keeping the hedgerow. If the hedgerow is gonna stay, but there'll be no additional trees.
Mhm.
Yeah, because taking out that hedgerow right there would actually make the that sort of Old Stage Road.
And
Yes.
again, from an applicant perspective, you know, we're not gonna spend any time or money clearing land that we don't have to clear. I mean, the land would be prepared for the building site, which would be where the roads would go, where the home sites would go. And, you know, the stormwater pond, anything that's required as part of the infrastructure. And beyond that, we have no need or desire to want to go and, you know, cutting down stuff just for the sake of cutting it down.
And portions of that as well are within the wetland buffer.
Right.
So you couldn't really be in there unless you're just doing
In
invasives.
fact, I think a big part of that hedgerow there on Old Stage Road is far enough south where you're starting to get into that class 2, or at least part of it would be in that class 2 element.
Yeah. So next would be, second easiest, residential zoning district. I've chosen to land this bylaw amendment in section 39.8 open space development, and specifically under 39.8.2, how much open space must be conserved. It's not quantitative, and then it lists all of the different things that shall and maybe should be within the open space. So at the very end of that list, you'll see 39.823, which calls out specific plan with the property parcel ID number. And it says the specific plan shall provide 53.8 plus or minus acres of open space as substantial benefit for the purpose of upholding view shed, working landscape, and conservation goals of the town plan with those town plan citations. The discretionary permit shall include irrevocable offers of dedication to the town for the ownership of the open space area. Floating easements for path connectivity towards the south and west may be required across minor sections of private land that may exist between the proposed dedicated open space and the two neighborhood clusters. So that actually makes more sense when you just look at the site plan. Let me show the site plan.
Clarifying question, Emily, if the 53.8 acres is already without the pond area, right?
That's correct.
Yes,
It also takes out the Wind Ridge Road right
yes,
of way.
yeah. So the floating trail easement might be required. It might be a section of private land between this multi-use path and the town on open space, so being able to traverse that.
And that we haven't done a plat or anything, so the boundaries aren't set, so that's why it's 38.5 plus or minus, you know. Rather than an easement, could we just pull the town land to the rec path or something like that? So it could get bigger, it could get less,
Mhm.
but it's approximately that amount.
And then the last statement in 39 is other bylaw amendments can be found in chapter 11, chapter 26, and referred to appendix K. So if me and Matt and any of the planning staff aren't here and 30 years down the road, someone has a question, you hit Control F for Glaser and it's all right there. It's really easy to find and know where it connects to other parts of the bylaw, and you have the appendix of the whole history right there. If any questions come up. And I do note that it includes that purpose of upholding view shed, working landscape, and conservation. So if in the future, you know, there's a desire to put a structure somewhere, that language is, it would have to be run up against that language of, are we still working in concert with those goals?
Is this the right place to bring up the pond matter again? I know that has been resolved last time. Is that it's just this awkward, you know, exclusion from the town, from the land dedicated to the town, that will be dedicated to the town. So that for liability reasons, so that pond will then become whose property again? The abutting property.
As far as this application is concerned, it's gonna
Glaser.
retain the Glaser.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Would go with that property.
Potentially, it would get a boundary line adjustment with that property, but that would be a separate.
It's kind of like immaterial to this discussion.
Right, exactly. Where it goes afterwards.
Actually, it may have to have some form of boundary line adjustment because we can't create a landlocked parcel. And in this zoning district, all lots need to have frontage on public or private road. And it's not like agro where it can just be an easement.
Okay.
So it probably would need to get BLA'd.
That's our intention.
Yeah.
That's a detail, but I think the plan is that it would go to the abutting property.
That's what they've agreed to.
Yeah, and my staff recommendation is do the Windridge Road boundary line adjustment subdivision thing, do this BLA as separate applications. They're much simpler applications to process, so those could even take place
Yeah.
before this works through planning commission or select board, because no matter what happens to the land, both of those things just make sense for,
Yeah.
So when you say separate, you mean separate from the specific plan,
yeah, like you could file your
separate from the subdivision that. would-
separate from the BLA and subdivision, you could file these applications tomorrow for put Windridge Road on its own lot, do this BLA, and that would probably be my recommendation is get these little straggling things out of the way.
Yeah, Windridge Road is within an existing right of way, so that's done. It's but we want to do the boundary line adjustment with a pond for Act 50 jurisdictional reasons ahead of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so it is its own parcel, it's not on this?
Correct. Windridge Road is its own monument right of way.
Okay, cool, so then that would just be, give us that documentation
Yeah.
so we can check that off
Yeah.
the charge, that makes it even easier.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's just one.
Yeah, that would be that would be reflected in the survey, right, Brian? You're gonna have to do a survey for the subdivision,
yes,
so it'd be reflected in the survey, that would feed into that.
yes.
And the last bylaw amendment is growth management. I will share the language that I've provided, and then upon further consideration, might recommend something that is more understandable and manageable. So in growth management, I've landed this under section 11.2 applicability. What developments are subject to growth management? Residential things. Are there exemptions? There's exemptions to existing lots created before 1990, minor subdivisions, affordable housing. And then there would be a new section 11.2.3 after 11.2.2, 11.2.3 that says Glaser specific plan can proceed from pre-application to discretionary permit. The DRB must make findings that the discretionary permit upholds a growth management score of at least 50 points based on the criteria of chapter 11 as amended October 4th, 2022. That basically means this current version of the bylaw. Other types of projects that can go from pre-app to discretionary permit are projects that meet the high flyer criteria. No one's ever done that, but that is a route. Or providing affordable housing that's at or below 80% AMI. So if a project is all affordable units, you don't have this additional permitting lag in your cycle. It doesn't change any other elements of the project in terms of it still has to meet that minimum 30-point score. The DRB has to make findings about that, still has to meet all of the other design criteria of the bylaw. So they would go from pre-application to discretionary permit. What I have worded here on the timing is based on the allocation schedule, which can vary widely from what an actual project's construction start date is, because allocation happens before you've got your full site plan reviewed, before you've gone to Act 50, before you've even like figured out who probably your contractors are gonna be on this
Before
project.
engineering.
Before engineering, so there's a lot of lag time between getting your allocation and when you actually start breaking down. And we see a lot of lumpiness in that allocation schedule because you could have this timeline and you're greenlit to pull permits for everything, but you're not feasibly ready until several years down the road. So my recommendation would be instead to simplify this language, and let me find my Word document. To say, following discretionary permit approval and final plans filing, The applicant may receive administrative permits for new dwellings up to a maximum of 18 dwellings per year until project completion. So this takes out some of that unpredictability and that lumpiness in,
That's saying it's following.
yeah, the way growth management allocation rules of 11.5 are set up is once your first unit is available, your whole schedule is greenlit. And then later on down the road, you could roll into some slow build things that could be very challenging for a project to actually finish. So this makes it much more predictable because administrative permit means you can start go digging in the dirt on your foundation. And that point in the process, you've paid your impact fees, you know what your building and floor plans are gonna look like. It's much more predictable to sign allocation based on the permit. You're more likely to know when the construction start and certificate will be issued. Whereas it's trying to look into a crystal ball, if a project gets allocation now, knowing when they'll actually start constructing.
Act 250 permitting is, it's a bear, and sometimes it can take a while to cut through too, so that's a big step also, that's after the town process.
Yeah, the other thing is, and I talked to Emily about this, is that, you know, our, what we've asked for all along, because we understand we're asking for something that's different than what's typical. And that there are some concerns about the, you know, the phasing, which is the words used in state law, how many units are gonna come on. So, you know, we've all along have been committed to this idea that we won't build more than a certain number of dwelling units at any one time. So, you know, it's not gonna be 50 or 60 dwelling units are all gonna come online all at one time. That was never our intention. And, you know, that's really contrary to the intent of growth management, aside from the particulars of the mechanics. It's not really the intent of growth management. So, you know, we just want to make that point that, you know, we just want to have a pace that's workable, but we don't have any desire to come in all at once and build a ton of units. All at
So
once.
can I, just because I'm not familiar, another, Northridge or whatever is building 100 units. Under growth management, how many units typically would you build per year? You know, if you said, I'm gonna build 110 units, what's like the normal cadence that they would be built?
Well, I don't know what they're building, but my guess is I would be surprised if they're building more than 10 a year.
So Northridge has 39 units.
I
They-
just picked Northridge, but like.
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
a, that's a
just-
good
just
one
in
to
general.
use, actually.
2/3 of the way through.
Yeah, they're.
They have 5 units left to pull. Want 5 more administrative permits. They started with
Out of
pre-application
30, out of 39.
out of 39, and they started with pre-application in 2016. But I don't think they started moving dirt. Ken, were you here when they started
No,
moving dirt?
I had already retired, so probably 19, I think,
I think 2019 as well. So 19, 20, 21, 22,
4 years.
23.
So 4 years to
And
build
a year.
35 dwelling units.
I'd say that was a very fast build out too. Very
Creek's
fast.
Edge was also pretty fast. That one was
Creek's Edge was
35
fast, yeah.
units.
Yeah.
And that one probably prepped around the same time as Northridge or a year before.
Before, I think, or they were contemporary when they came in, but Chris worked through the whole process quicker, I think.
Mhm.
But so,
I'm just trying to get a sense, like, the phasing piece and 100 units all at once. The flip side of that is 18 units a year over 8 years. 8 years just seems like a long time for the neighboring community to, you know, construction, trucks in and out, 8 years. It's like K-8 school.
well, so here's what I would say about that, Cal. So first of all, during the,
The dirt moving happens at once and then,
Right.
yeah. it's
so,
like-
you know, somebody's building a house. So at some point, will there be a big truck that arrives? Yeah, somebody's gonna have to pour concrete. They're gonna pour a foundation. But once the foundation is poured, so somebody's built the road, they put the water and the sewer lines and all that stuff, all the grading's been done. They pour a foundation. Then after that, you basically have carpenters, plumbers, and electricians,
Right.
you know. They're showing up in pickup trucks, you
Yeah.
know, and they're probably not all gonna be there at the same time. There's gonna be a certain phasing of that, but that's what you would like to see. Now, the
The
other,
moving phase is really only gonna happen once, you know, at the beginning, the grading and,
the other is what I would say is remember, this is really, there's two separate development areas.
yeah,
So everything's not all gonna happen in one place. So there's a development area on Old Stage Road, that horseshoe, I call the Horseshoe Road.
yeah,
And then there's another development area on Mountain View Road. So everything's not all gonna be concentrated in one place. Everything's not all gonna happen at one time. You know, there would be, probably you would see the greatest amount of activity of what you're asking about would be sort of early on, because you
Yeah.
have to do grading. You know, you gotta put pipes in the ground and,
Yeah.
you know, all that sort of stuff.
Will that be done for both pieces at the same time though, or would you like start on one, and then start building on that one, and then maybe a couple of years later, start the grading on the other piece?
It's likely that the horseshoe loop would go first because sewer's in that area prior to cul-de-sac going second.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think that they'd be done at the same time. I think it'd be one then the other. I just would mention also about Northridge is that the northern part of Northridge is primarily, you know, custom built, single family homes, you know, much higher price point, where here it's mostly duplexes and triplexes. So I would expect, you know, from a unit count perspective, that to go faster than Northridge.
yeah, okay, and we really, my question was just trying to understand, like, the rate of building, is it consistent with what is normal? It sounds like
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
In line with kind of
Yeah.
normal construction speed.
I would say if it was to go through the growth management process, you're looking at more units and a slower build out, extending that time frame into, could be 15 years.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
It
projects,
wouldn't start till later either.
there's projects in South Burlington that are 100 units that, you know, can take, or, you know, 150, 200 units that can take 20 years.
yeah,
You know, so being 100 units and having a 18 unit, you know, that we're hoping we can meet and plan to meet. It's beneficial to us to go as fast as we can.
right,
And we plan to, and that's our, you know, benefit from the open space that we're here in town.
And then the business cycle aside, which nobody really knows what that's likely to be, you know.
Sure.
You know, is it gonna be a soft landing later this year? Is it gonna be a deep dive? We can.
yeah,
But typically what you would see is with a subdivision in the build out is initially there would be permits that would be pulled to start building the infrastructure. And then you might see a few dwelling units might get started.
yeah,
When you get the infrastructure in place, there would be a period where you'd see a lot of activity. And then oftentimes it tapers off at the end. That's, I mean, I would say that's sort of the norm.
I would agree.
yeah, okay.
So Emily, that second thing that you mentioned, the most recent,
Yeah, so you don't,
slightly altered, do we not have that in?
right, because this was actually like a hot off the press, talking it through with Ken after this was
And it's
published.
basically the second half of what we do have will be different.
Yep, so
That
it's-
paragraph.
the DRB still needs to make the findings on 50 points. It still has to go through pre-application and discretionary permit. It's just rather than tying it up in these honestly very complex and hard to administer rules that hard for staff to understand, hard for the applicant to understand, just be really clear and say 18 administrative permits, because that's super easy for everybody to track. And then it's way more predictable for planning and all the other town departments. You know, there's not going to be more than 18 houses with foundations being dug in the dirt that year for this project. Whereas under the regular allocation schedule, once that's greenlit, theoretically, you could, you know, be working on far more.
Just, so you have dwelling units here, but in the other language, it was dwelling unit equivalents.
Correct. They are not proposing any units that are half a DUE.
Okay,
But this just makes it clear that it's dwelling units, so density and growth management allocation is looked at on the DUE. So each cell in that table, and the other table was actually like 1 2-bedroom unit or 2 1-bedroom units. This simplifies it by just focusing on dwelling units, and they're not proposing anything with 1 bedroom, so we don't have to get into that.
So is a duplex 2 dwelling units under this?
Yeah,
Okay.
because all the units have more than 2 bedrooms. It's things that are a studio or a 1-bedroom, regardless of it being attached or detached unit.
Okay.
This keeps the math easy for everybody. And then the part of growth management is the administration table. So this is an illustrative tool. It's not part of the bylaw. It's just what staff uses to keep track and help the DRB stay on track. So it shows, growth center has the most dwelling unit equivalents. Each one of those cells is a dwelling unit equivalent. Then you have RZD. It's impossible to read on this screen, I'm sorry, but you can see where words are written. That means it's been assigned to a project. Ag rural, no one has anything across the next 10 years. And then for illustrative purposes, we would show the Glaser no more than 18 per year until completion.
In the year is a town fiscal year, correct?
Yeah, and based on the new language, we would no longer need this fiscal year language that's on the table. Because you can, this is trying to tie your allocation to a fiscal year, but it has no real bearing on when you pull a permit. Now we're just tying it to when you pull up an administrative permit. So the fiscal year is,
So is that the start of the year, once they ask for the first permit? Does that start their time? They can't exceed 18 till that time next year? Is that the way that works?
Well, the fiscal year starts July
Well,
1.
I thought you were saying it's not tied to the fiscal year. Wasn't that what you just said? Emily? Maybe I misunderstood.
well, the administrative permits would be tied to the fiscal year, but it wouldn't, in growth management, you get your allocation across this 10-year horizon. And every year, one year falls off, a new one is added. So it's this 10-year rolling horizon. For an individual project, let's take, for example, this one's brand new, the Rice subdivision. They have 2 affordable units in FY 25, and then their rest are in 28, 29, 30. Once the FY 2025 starts, which is July 1st of this year, Rice can pull all their permits on the table because their first ones are are green. So once your FY 25 units start, you can pull permits for everything across that table, even though some are shown graphically in this system as FY 2030. On the flip side of that, you can build everything across that cycle, but if you delay too long for too many years, those first units become stale, they become slow built. So the farther out you get from that first year of allocation without building houses, you might get into this slow build world, which basically you don't want to do it. It becomes an administrative nightmare. And then it's unpredictable for the town because you don't know when these units are going to be built. Whereas administrative permits, if you say no more than 18 per year, you know how many houses could possibly come online from that project, because it's much more predictable to know from construction start date, that unit will probably come online next year. Whereas once growth management is allocated, that project could die at various phases of all the permit reviews, or find out they can't, it's too costly to build, and just go poof. We've had that happen to projects, and they're on this allocation schedule. We see them out in the horizon, but then they never actually come to fruition. So the way we're proposing it is a much more predictable.
So before the end of the meeting tonight, there's gonna be a quiz.
Yeah, I was gonna say, this is kind of confusing to me. I've never dealt with this before, but as long as the bottom line is they can't exceed 18 per year, is that correct? No
They can't
matter how,
exceed
no
18
matter
per
whether it's a slow build or fast build or whatever, as long as in a given fiscal year, they can't exceed.
That's it.
18.
That's all we've asked
Yeah,
for.
Yeah.
okay, so that makes That's all the,
The only other thing that I would mention is, I think one of the things in the charge was that there would be something about when it might start. And I think it's sort of a, you know, we're as a sort of a penciled in date, talking about no sooner than FY 24. What we said, FY 24?
Yeah, best case scenario.
FY 24, which would start July 1st
Of this year.
of this year.
Well, no, it would,
No.
so you would, after final plans is when you could start pulling administrative permits. So their start date would be based upon when they finish their permitting. So
I think
once,
there's something in the charge though, about we're supposed to have a date. And, you know, we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, you know, it goes from this committee, goes to planning commission, goes to select board, then we have to go to the DRB, and we're gonna have to go to Act 250. It could easily be another anywhere from 12 to 18 months before we're ready to do anything, you know, in the earth.
so charge item number 4, applicant has requested 25 DUE a year. That's changed over 4 years in addition to the 80 growth target. Applicant staffing committee shall consider a realistic construction start date when assigning the first fiscal year of allocation. So that language, when I drafted that language, I was thinking about it in terms of the allocation rules as they exist in
The
the
big
bylaw.
spreadsheet.
The big spreadsheet. The big spreadsheet is an illustration of the rules in chapter 11. Because we're giving this project much more discrete, more limiting rules based on administrative permit, you don't need this fiscal year start date, because it's just tied to when they finish their permitting. Whereas you start getting your allocation, a project starts getting its allocation and can finish getting all its allocation before it actually has all its permits in place to move dirt.
Right.
Because you have to, after allocation, you get your discretionary, you go to Act 250, you start pulling your first infrastructure permit. So even though a project has allocation under the current rules, they actually can't start moving dirt and building until they finish all these other steps. So that's why you tie the fiscal year in that system.
Yeah, and you know, it's fine with us. We just want to make sure that we're, you know, addressing all the things in the charge. And as I said, you know, we would still have a ways to go before we would actually, anything might get built.
I apologize for belaboring this point. I'm trying to do my math in my head. So permits do not equal to the physical or even the breaking of the ground, right? When you get 18, you're allowed a maximum of 18 dwelling units
Permits for
per
houses.
year.
Permits for houses.
Yes.
So that's how, I mean,
That's
that's how the staff would keep track of the 18 units. They would keep track of how many permits did we issue for houses. So,
And there's different kinds of permits too. So the DRB approves a discretionary permit. But just because the DRB says yes, one day doesn't mean the next day you can go out and start digging in the dirt. You have to file your final plans, and then you have to file administrative permits. And the administrative permits lets you actually do work. And there's usually significant lag time. And our administrative permit says, this lets you do what you need to do in terms of the Williston zoning, but be aware you might have state and federal other permits that apply.
so Act 250 comes after that.
Yeah, Act 250
administrative.
comes after discretionary permit.
Before administrative permit.
right,
Yeah,
so discretion, the way I used to say it was that all a discretionary permit allows you to do is to apply for an administrative permit. So the administrative permit is sort of the last stop. And, you know, so the applicant would submit, you know, we're gonna build a house, we're gonna build a duplex structure or a triplex structure. We'd come in with an application,
Mhm.
and then you'd have to show that it's in compliance with the discretionary permit that the DRB has approved. You know, whatever the details might be, is it in the same place that you said it was going to be? Does it line up with the infrastructure that's required, whatever, you know, the whole 9 yards, but it's all just sort of the final details. And then demonstrating compliance with the discretionary permit, but it's the last stop before you actually go and do any work. there's a great table on the town's website that I authored 15 years ago.
That we still use.
Table's great, maybe not, no, I'm just kidding.
That just kind of goes down sequentially how the permitting process works.
Yeah, it isn't easy to understand for sure.
Gonna have a quiz, remember, guys. Send me a quiz.
Yeah, don't with me. Okay. So what do we, I guess we're not allowed to, I don't know, Emily, you still have more, right?
That's
Or is
it
that-
for bylaw amendments.
Because I would think one of the steps would be for us to vote on whether we agree with these or accept these. Is that kind of the
Right.
next step maybe, or
Yeah, that would kind of be the next step.
which we can't do?
Right, we can't vote
There's only
on.
3 of us.
Yeah.
It sounds like you three are feeling good with these bylaw amendments. Yeah.
Yeah,
It is, I'm taking your word for it on a bunch of this stuff because I don't fully understand how it works. But
yeah, I mean, my only concern is that like we did several months of work and it's now like 6 sentences, but you know, ultimately the town has to administer what we've discussed and, you know, this will do it. And obviously everything's in the appendix, but it's a little shocking to see how few lines of text it took to convey
well, there's a big
that.
chunk in there with the 50 points that needs to
Yeah,
And
considered and have to be looked at one by one, and everybody will have to agree that they get those points.
Yeah.
That's an
And then,
important
of
piece.
course, the old adage about a picture is worth 1,000 words. There's the plan.
right.
The
Yeah.
plan
And modify.
inherent in there is also, there's the open space that we've talked about. As well as, where those development areas would be, the number of dwelling units that we're proposing, all of those
Yeah.
things are.
Maybe I
part
shouldn't
of
have
it.
said concern, more just, I guess, surprised.
Well,
Yes, yeah,
I think it speaks to the project that we're not asking for much relief of what would be required anyway.
And I think the plan has modified throughout this, at least in the beginning, every time we met, it was different in response to what our concerns were. And
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point because, we'll be transmitting the plan, but it could change further, I guess, as it goes through planning and select board. Right, like if somebody, I don't know, public comment or planning commission, like this is a question, like, could there be further revision to what is proposed?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a bylaw amendment. And the bylaw amendment process is that it starts with the planning commission. This is what's prescribed by state law. And, you're essentially advisory to the planning commission. And then, but ultimately, it's the planning commission review is really where that's where stuff is gonna happen officially, is
Okay.
right there. So we get to the point where the planning commission says they would hear whatever you have to say, they would look at the plan, they would look at the draft language that's proposed, and then they would have to vote and say, we want to hold a public hearing. So that's the first thing, that they would vote to hold a public hearing. And there's procedural requirements in Vermont state law. Staff would make sure those are taken care of. And then there would be a public hearing. And then the planning commission would close the public hearing and they would discuss, what they want to do. And so, yeah, there would be opportunities for them to tweak the plan some more than what we've already done here. So, and then if it comes out of the planning commission, it goes to the select board. The select board has to look at the work, then they have to say, do we want to hold a public hearing? They would have to vote to decide to have a public hearing. Then they would need to schedule a public hearing, meeting the requirements of Vermont state law,
Okay,
take testimony. Then they would close the public hearing, then they would decide what they want to do. They could send it back to the planning commission. They could approve it, they could deny it, they could send it back to the planning commission for revision. So There's all
And if
kinds of
the-
opportunities.
Yeah, and if the select board makes substantive changes, they would have to rewarn another hearing too,
Right,
to bylaw amendments.
right,
I also want to note that when it gets transmitted to the planning commission, that's the recommendation from staff would be before you warrant your public hearing. We also want to do all the legal review to make sure that our bylaw language and the other mechanisms that would precipitate from that, the attorneys are nodding heads on, so we don't get down to the select board and some red flag comes up, or worse, discretionary permit when the specific plan's already been approved. So that the legal review takes place before the select board goes, or the planning commission select board go through the owner's process of a hearing. So that is a good segue. What Ken was talking about aligns with this general timeline that I pulled together. Again, sorry, it's hard to read on the table, but explains where we started back in January, the committee work over the past couple months, and then the hearing processes going forward, both for bylaw amendments with planning commission, select board, and then DRB. And I want to say this timeline is like going 100 in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. Like, it is turning things around lickety split. And it is also a schedule that's assuming that once a hearing is ready to go, that it's able to be accommodated on the next available agenda. We know for a fact with the select board, sometimes something gets transmitted from the planning commission, but it might not be for another meeting or two before they have an informational session or their public hearing. Just this timeline is like super compressed, and it probably would take several months and maybe even a year or two longer than what is on this table.
right. So I would say the odds to me would favor that on June the 6th, the planning commission would talk about it and they might continue it to another meeting, maybe to, the second meeting in June or perhaps to July. So, any delay, step, continuation early on, just ratchets on down the road.
Design plans take a while too.
So I guess it's good to see
Yeah.
you stay on time.
I just noticed, I think a typo at the bottom of those, because we had this January and February, it should be 2024 at the bottom.
There you go.
Correct. Good catch.
Oh, darn, I thought it was gonna be.
The only staff
We need to
memo
vote
that
on that.
doesn't have a typo is the one that hasn't been written yet. Everything I write has some typo in it somewhere. Ken, I'm wondering if it might be helpful for you and I to work on a draft like master memo from the committee that summarizes some of the unlimited powers of advisement things that have come up. So to Kyle's point, we're only making a couple very minor tweaks to the bylaw, but there might be some other recommendations about the future use of that view shed area, about lease agreements with Windswept Farm, some of the things that are precipitated from the charge, maybe something about this parking lot as well, whether that happens with the construction of the road or at future town's discretion. So outlining the things that the committee has said throughout this process into a master memo, because we know going into the planning commission and select board hearings, they're all going to be seeing this brand new. They won't know some of the iterative process that the committee went through and where the committee landed on a recommendation. And then if they're considering any tweaks, they can say, well, here's what a quick summary of what the committee was. And I don't know if it's kind of like a call and response. We'll work through this, Ken, but like a call and response to the charge. That's like just a really brief thing. I know because, for example, Tina Moss is in the room and Mike and Tina emailed me. And one of the questions that they wanted to bring up to you guys was the recommendation on the term of the lease. So there's been some talk, very informally, about what length that lease agreement would be. And with a horse facility where people are lodging their horses there, leasing space, programming, it's not like a hayfield where you can just say, oh, 1 year lease, next year don't go plant your corn, it's a lot longer of, it's like slowing down a train.
Is that under
Yeah.
the purview of this committee?
Well, I think it would be a good idea for the committee to just summarize these recommendations so that the planning commission and select board wouldn't be working from scratch. And both of those boards do like to work from, like, what has the committee before us thought about this? And we have done a lot of thought about, we want to be supportive of Windswept Farm. We want the town to have some flexibility with the view shed space, but maybe not a whole community center and a giant parking lot. We want to keep the options open for these floating easements and these potential trailer path alignments along with official map. So just some of those broader brush things so that the planning commission and select board have a reference point to look back on.
Well, and first and foremost, I think it's important, and we've done some of that here, is for everybody to make sure that they know what it is that's being asked. So that's the first thing, is just to be clear on what it is that's being asked or what it is that's being proposed. You know, so if the Mosses, for example, have some idea of what would work best for them, it would be useful to know what that is. You know, certainly from the applicant perspective, we're looking to dedicate the land to the town. And, you know, so the town would basically be in the driver's seat in terms of how that lease agreement might work in terms of its term. I do remember that when the Catamount property was under discussion for town ownership, there was some fairly lengthy discussion about lease terms and all that sort of stuff. And it was a similar kind of thing, as I recall. You know, I think what ended up getting settled on was that would be 5 years and that would be reviewed after 5 years. But it was a similar kind of thing, like going year to year could be a challenge. So that would be important to know from your perspective, what you think would work best for you, so that everybody understands what that is. And then that can be presented.
I'll be comfortable with that, Ken, rather than it, you know, certainly we've talked about it as a committee, but then without probably the more important part of that term to be part of that conversation, I think it's helpful for us to get your perspective. So then, you know, we're not just gonna go in and say, no, just do it year to year. I mean, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So Ken, that's a good point to be, you know, asking the Mosses about their perspective on the term.
You can send me an email, you can talk to Emily, you can send Emily an email, have whatever, you know,
Give
just
us a
let us know.
call. Yeah.
Just let us know.
What we would, what would the language be?
What's the length of the term for the lease that would be ideal for you?
Okay.
Or, yeah, I guess broad brush, like length of the terms or terms and conditions in the lease that you would like to see or might be a red flag for you in standard lease agreements. And Ken and I can take that language and then
Right.
frame it in a broad brush way so that if the time comes around that the select board's looking at this lease agreement, we have, you know, some structure to think off of already.
So my guess is you probably have in your head a short list of a couple of or more specific things that are necessary for you to make it workable.
Okay.
And just identify what those are. And I would say one of those would be the term, you know, the length of time, that would be one. Are there specific areas within the open space that you would want to make sure that you would be able to utilize?
Right.
Are there any specific things that, you know, we've sort of talked about, for lack of a better word, barriers or protective things to sort of separate horse and human, you know, things like that. So, I mean, those are the things that just come to mind right off the top of my head. There's the hang portion
Yeah.
on the north
that's
side
fine.
of the open space.
Mhm.
So tell us what you would, in your dream of dreams, what you would want. And my guess is it's probably a fairly succinct list. And then, as Emily said, we can, you know, sort of turn that into, you know, governmental boilerplate.
Yeah.
Now, would it be helpful, if she gave an explanation why she wants it, let's say 5 years, just so you have like, so she just read why I'd like a 5-term lease, but it's sort of.
Right, so,
What's the motivation? behind
this
it?
would work best for us because it probably doesn't need to be, you know, a master's thesis, but,
Just, yeah, like a.
you know, something fairly succinct.
A succinct good letter. And then that'd be helpful too, when the planning commission rolls back around, because there was so much public input throughout the process about wanting to make sure that Windswept Farm is viable. And if we keep that information at the forefront, that'll be helpful when, you know, the select board's signing a lease agreement.
So would that, the next users of this property, I mean, Tina, you and Mike aren't gonna use it for the next 50 years or anything. Do we need to be concerned about being flexible with the next set of leases that come up for this conservation ag use of the land, or is that a worry?
I would worry less about that. The only thing that would be important is to make sure that the town has like a general vision of if they wanted to do something more permanent with the view shed space beyond just haying it, that's not precluded.
Or even just have people be aware that there will be future users that, you know, may have different objectives, that they have to maintain the requirements like the conservation and the working landscape and all that stuff, but might have a different set of lease requirements.
Right, yeah, so that would, this property, its deed and conveyance to the town would be part of that review of a new lease agreement that would be conveyed based upon if there's a new user, who that new user would be coming up with a new lease agreement, yeah.
Yeah, so what I would think would be, number one, in the lease agreement, it would specify what the term of it is. It would specify what sorts of things the leaseholder would be allowed to do or not do. And so there's only things, certain things they would be allowed to do, only certain amounts of the land that they would be allowed to use. And I mean, I would think that what the town would want to do is that before a different operator were to come in, it would have to be reviewed by the town.
I
So,
mean, do we want to limit structures in it? The town, even if they're ag structures? Or not, I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, could they then put a barn up in the viewscape area for more use, you know, for horse?
I would think you probably want to prohibit permanent structures. So for example, if there were going to be I don't know what the right word is, you know.
Like those little shade structures.
Or a course,
Yeah,
right?
that would be like the only thing that. we
Jumping
would-
course.
but we don't even do that.
Yeah.
But a jumping course is one of the things that we have out on that.
Is that the right word?
Yeah, like,
We have a course, yeah, I mean, but all that can be taken down.
yeah, so like temporary things like a
Right.
jumping course or a rink, or even those little, you know, 10 by 10 shade structures that you can just move with the tractor.
Yeah,
Versus
I
like
just
a-
want to be concerned about
Yeah.
somebody building a big barn in areas that might impact the viewscape or impact.
I agree with that, Gary. I think there needs to be some language in there that will
Yeah.
future-proof
I know.
the
that we
usage
would
of
do
that
Yeah, I know you would,
Yeah.
but there's always the next
I don't see
person,
that we
and it's good to have the different boards aware of that could be a possibility in the future.
Mhm.
You know, I guess I have a question, just maybe it's a procedural question, but this is outside of the specific plan. Like whatever lease that gets drawn up is gonna be a lease that's done post specific plan. So what I'm thinking is, maybe I'm wrong, but it's all related. But at the same time, the committee has a certain charge about the question of does the project warrant a specific plan? And if so, I think the committee has to address that, and then there are a number of other topics that are very related, like the lease for the horse farm, but they're really outside of the consideration of the specific plan. So what I'm thinking is, how do you transmit the two distinct and yet interrelated components of all the topics? we
Well,
discussed?
what I'm imagining would go back to what Emily said at the beginning of this topic, is that in the transmittal, there would be some general recommendations about the kinds of things that would be included in the lease agreement.
So,
But that's outside, I mean, what I'm thinking is, can you say specific plan components? Whatever number of bullets there are, and then outside the specific plan, but items for additional consideration for various stakeholder committees, departments in the town.
yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking is like the formal transmittal will be the bylaw amendments and the site plan. And then responses to the charge that are directly related to that. And then there's other parts of this charge that are, like what you said, they're related, but they're kind of a separate path. So charge item number 8 is about exploring arrangements to allow for Windswept Farm pros and cons and options. So separate from the bylaw amendment transmittal, we would say this site plan keeps Windswept Farm viable. Here's what their considerations would be in a future lease agreement. The advisory committee is in support of this. We recognize it's separate from specific plan, but a future thing to be in consideration of.
Right, so there could be, like, for example, just as a simple, recommendation that there be provisions in the plan to prohibit the erection of permanent structures in the open space, for example.
Right. I was thinking about the open space and particularly the view shed, and part of this committee charge and discussion has been what uses or structures are or are not appropriate. So we know the forested area in the back 40 is presumed wetland. We kind of want to keep that forest and not touch it. We know the land directly around Windswept Farm is going to be part of their pasture land. And that in the short term, the 15 acres of view shed would be hayed. But longer term, part of this parking lot discussion is being able to provide public access to the view shed. And maybe we don't want the town in the future to construct a 300-car parking lot in a giant community center here, but maybe something like a small park pavilion with a little, state park style bathroom, where a place where you can enjoy the view. And somewhere, those are kind of like the two ends of the spectrum, from like just a little pavilion or gazebo to a community center. And there's probably a line in the
What
middle.
about like Overlook Park in South Burlington? That's like,
Yeah.
30
Yeah.
spots.
Maybe it's okay having some like walking paths through meadow or orchard, but maybe we don't want, a ball field that's mowed to heck. Maybe we don't want an athletic field. So probably coming up with an accounting, like a list of, here's what the vision is that the committee and the property owner are both comfortable with. And then that's our recommendation to the select board. If you take on this land in the short term, continue haying it to Windswept Farm. If you ever decide to do something different, here's our guidance on what is and is not compatible with the view shed. And then that can be something that, Ken and I can draft up some of those things, and you can probably at the next meeting, look at them.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, no, I feel good about that plan.
Yeah, I agree with that. This otherwise, if they're gonna start building things there, then it will defeat the purpose of this group, which is to preserve as best as we can, the scenic view shed.
And this is 15 acres, and even standing out there, it felt so huge. And I was looking at, I'm really familiar with the Richmond Green where they have their farmer's market and the play it ground, and drew a polygon around that. It's only 2 acres. And, the developed part of the village park where we have the volleyball courts and the rink and the bathhouse, that's only 2 acres. So really small amount of land can have a lot of good in terms of, you don't just enjoy this view driving 40 miles down an hour on Mountain View Road or just parking in this parking lot. You can have a picnic or, toss the ball in a very small land. And there's still 15 acres that is either, what's left of that 15 acres is still hayed or used in agriculture.
So we're gonna work on drafting this master memo. It's interesting you bring that up because Brian and I were just talking about this today, wondering about how, this would ultimately be transmitted to the planning commission. The one question in my mind would be, I think I have a pretty good feel for the kinds of things that the committee has raised, but as we know, we haven't really had any votes. How much time the committee is gonna need to sort of to digest that and develop a comfort level with, whatever specific language we might draft. That's just me thinking out loud. Should we be looking at the calendar and talking about the calendar and that score?
Well, can I just say something? Because that's partly why I was also thinking about what does this transmittal look like? And what does the select board ultimately need to vote on? Do they need to vote on everything? Or do they need, is there a more limited set of recommendations and bylaw amendments and things? What do they need ultimately to vote on? And then potentially there are things like some of these recommendations, since they haven't been written, there may be work crafting that needs to be done, especially if they're going to be something that's memorialized for future generations or future committees, future people. So I almost think, and I'm just putting this as an idea because I'm also realizing May 25th is coming soon. Can we kind of finalize very soon? Can we finalize what is needed for the specific plan? And potentially one of the other recommendations that comes out with a lot of the recommendations here is that there's, additional work that's done to flesh out some of these other details that are important, and yet they're not directly pertaining to the question of the specific plan.
And it could end up being like a moot point if the planning commission's got so much other stuff going on that if the June 6th got pushed to June 20th, just to give them a little bit more time on some things that are on their docket and give the committee more time, it could be a win-win there. I wouldn't know until talking to Matt tomorrow about what he's thinking for the planning commission and give another week or two to button it.
Yeah, I would think that would govern when we meet over the next, like if they really think they can look at it on the 6th of June.
Right.
We may want to meet next week because we couldn't vote on anything. And half the committee wasn't here today to kind of go through this in some form again. And then have the 25th for us to meet to final approve of the final documents. But if we find out that they can't do it till till the 20th, then maybe we don't need to meet every week. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out.
And I have a procedural question. So 3 people are missing, and so is it 3?
Mhm.
3 people are missing, so from committee. So do we need to make sure that they're in the loop of this organic conversations that's happening? I think it's just that, with the time fastly approaching, we're missing the folks, and so we need to keep them up to speed. So then, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
Well, they could review the recording and they have the documents,
Mhm.
and then they could form questions if they can't understand anything. Is that enough?
Well, here's what I would suggest. My suggestion would be, I don't think it makes any sense for there to be a vote of this committee without as many people in the committee being here. And it's to no one's benefit to short circuit that. It's not for the town's benefit, certainly not for ours. Make some sort of decision about when you want to meet next. And then either myself or Emily or some combination of the two can send an email out to the full committee saying, here's some information about your next meeting. Your next meeting will be on such and such a date, whether that's next week, the 18th, or the following week, the 25th.
So,
And based on the conversations that we had at the last meeting, this is what will be talked about. And then they would have notice of what's going to take place. We can tell them, we haven't decided on anything about anything other than we're gonna draft something for them to read. And that's as I understand it, that's sort of the only thing that's sort of has been really discussed about is drafting something that people would read and then would talk about and consider.
And Emily, you said you'll learn from Matt soon whether or not he thinks need to be completed by the 6th.
Right, so that was what the charge said, but if the planning commission has enough on their work plan that we could put this on the 20th, and it would be kind of a moot point for them, that might happen. I would say, let's meet 2 weeks from now, the 25th, because I've got a lot of other stuff going on where I probably wouldn't be able to meet with Ken to work on this master memo until later next week. And then I said no meeting on June 1st, but I kind of said that as like a backstop. If the only thing that were to happen on the 1st would be like a final vote, and maybe we're changing 1 or 2 simple things in like that master memo, then I can just PDF it the next day and upload it to the planning commission agenda on the 2nd for the 6th. But that June 1st, there couldn't be any major tweaks being made because Thursday night, I have to PDF it and put it online on the 2nd. So if it's just a not performative, but like a final meeting, we talked through everything on the 25th, maybe Ken and I made a couple tweaks, we're all in agreement and understanding everything on the 1st, it could probably still make it on the 6th, but it couldn't be any big things, typos.
Can that conversation be online or no? I mean, electronic, email, not necessarily a meeting on the 1st.
It would have to be, it could be in person or on Zoom, it has to happen in real time.
Well, yeah, I would just say for us to come back on the 25th, and I know, we all have other things going on from a logistics standpoint, I think makes some sense. And a potential opportunity for the committee to read some things, to talk about it and discuss it, but there's no pressure to vote at that moment in time, because that never works well. And then could come back ostensibly on the 1st to finalize whatever recommendations that you want to make.
The most exciting question is that would the CGI be ready by then, the 25th?
Yeah, I was gonna ask that too.
So we have reached out and they have told us that they plan to get it to us prior to the 25th.
Great.
Barring any setbacks, we should have that.
Nice.
Thank you.
June 1st, I'm not here, I'm gonna be able to be virtual, but it may be difficult, but I can, I'm 25th is fine.
So do we have any additional things to go over now?
The last thing was just the deliverables tracking, so the outstanding things from the charge are, if we need any comment from relevant state agencies on that tier 2 multi-use path, comment from the assessor. Number 8, the accounting of options for windswept is also incomplete, but I think that's gonna make sense being wrapped into, the master memo of side conversations. And then bylaw audit. We're complete there. I looked through the bylaw and compared this concept plan, and except for those 3 call outs that we're doing, it's gonna comply with everything else in terms of, road configuration requirements, outdoor lighting, landscaping around the homes and the proposed streets, like everything else will comply. So those are kind of the only outstanding things.
Should we be expected to get comments from state agencies about the tier 2 path if we're just providing floating easement for
That's a question for, I think, the committee, probably kind of like how we handled. We got comment from Public Works, and Fire, but we looked at the school's data instead of seeking direct comment. We don't have everybody here either.
Yeah. Would it be okay to discuss that on the 25th, or do we, I guess you'd need time to make that
I mean,
happen?
what would be the relevant state agencies?
So it would be the wetlands program. Would be the biggest one, and without a full delineation of that, past where we're showing a class
They're
two,
basically
that they're gonna
say,
ask
come
us
back if you have
to,
a plan.
the island hop, if we could, boardwalks.
So is
allowed
the
use.
class 2 is the primitive path? Is that what we call that
Yep,
in our language in the town?
primitive path, you typically don't need a permit for anything structural, any tree clearing, any, anything more than that, which,
Well, the state's not let us act on primitive trail easements within wetland buffers, and what the official map is showing would be a multi-use path connection, so the 10-foot wide paved thing, wetland or wetland buffer, we couldn't do a paving, it would have to be a raised boardwalk. I don't know if you know the price per linear foot difference, but I know it's significant.
if we're not proposing a connection through there, I don't see why we would even reach out to the
So
state.
we're proposing a floating easement, at least
Correct.
to the connection to the
To
town.
keep
land.
the option open, but
Right.
we're not being charged with the feasibility of constructing a path through there. So,
So that might be like one of the last things to get a head nod, straw poll from the whole committee, like if we're fine with knowing that the site plan keeps the option open and would have to go through extensive delineation and permit review for applicant or town to pursue it.
Because I'm not even sure what the state, they're gonna say, you don't have a plan.
Yeah, you can't tell us where you're doing it.
You can't tell us where you're putting it, so like, when you have it drawn, you come back to us.
they can cite the wetland rules and say this is what's required, but
So
until
they're
they
just
see
kind
a
of
proposal,
satisfied.
they're supposed to.
Yeah,
I guess I don't either.
So you can wait.
we can't vote on it, but it seems like we're, I think it's okay.
Or I guess, Brian, you could just reach out and say, can you confirm that these are the wetland rules that may or may not apply? Because the state without a delineation and without a proposed alignment isn't gonna wanna comment on a concept, but you could at least provide the rules and citations that would say, if there is wetland, this is what you'd have to do. And those are, because those are all in their regulations.
Yeah.
That would probably suffice.
Yeah. Anything else?
That's it for
Adjourn 4 minutes early. 3 minutes.
I had a couple of questions with the minutes. Is that something that we can tackle next time because we need to vote on it anyway?
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
I'll reserve those 2 comments. Nothing critical, just more.
Well, they are
Clarify.
track, they are track changeable, so if you wanted to putting them as track changes, or reach out to Ken or me, and we can put them in as track changes.
Oh, the only last thing.
Yeah, just remind you, there was no Zoom.
Sorry,
It was all transcribed from my notes.
On the,
That's right.
the 18 dwelling unit per year, I know we're going way back, but you wouldn't be in a situation where you'd be like, oh man, I wish we had 22. Or like 18 is something that you feel like, guys, I'm just trying to think about, I don't know, is 18 a high enough ceiling, or like, is there some situation you can get in and be like, man, I really wish we could at 22, 23?
I think it's workable, and you may recall, we originally asked for 25, and it was for the kind of reasoning that you're asking about right now, which is that make sure that what you asked for is enough that you think it will encompass what would be the most aggressive build out? And then there was a fine tuning. It's like, we only have a certain amount of manpower. There's only a certain, there's only a certain amount of capacity
Sure.
to actually do it. And so there's a comfort level with that number. We'll double check to make sure before we go forward, but I think there's a pretty high comfort level that would encompass what would be necessary.
Okay.
Colin, you're saying that because you want to build faster.
Well, I mean, I just, thinking from my own experience, sometimes things are like ahead of schedule, or, it's like market conditions are like, yeah, we can't build them fast, just trying to think of, I don't know, any
The
like,
options open.
keeping your options open
Yeah.
as you go.
I think that's an unintended clunkiness of the typical growth management cycle anyway. You end up building in pieces and, the uncertainty of it can be tough.
Right.
And one of the reasons, for us to go for 18 units a year rather than worry about, allocation expiring and getting into the slow build scenario is it really handcuffs your, what is it, 4 units a year or something? It's slow build, named that for a reason.
Yeah,
So,
really mostly just flexibility, like it's not, I just, from a rigidity standpoint, like you just get like boxed into something that makes it difficult to operate, but ultimately, you guys gotta do it, so.
Yeah, we're comfortable with 18, we'll take more, but,
Yeah,
we thought 18 was a good compromise.
And it says maximum of, so
But they could end up
they could
pulling
end
fewer.
up with 15 or,
Okay.
20.
Yeah.
Fiscal year's July, so,
Right,
first
and
half of
that's,
summer.
you know,
second half of summer sort of thing.
we've been listening to all the commentary, and clearly, one of the concerns is, how many dwelling units might come online all at one time, and not wanting that to be too great. So we've been sensitive to that, and that was, built into the request from the beginning, understanding that that will be an issue. And,
Mhm.
it's all a balancing act.
got it.
Yeah,
Last question, I promise. Are the affordable homes usually get built first or in the middle or towards the end?
Typically middle to end. Right out of the gate, you have all your permanent costs, upfront costs, infrastructure costs, so usually the affordability component comes towards the middle or the end, not typically right out of the gate.
Yeah, the last 5 units in Northridge that need permits are the affordable ones.
So they're last.
Mhm. And they kind of started like back working forward, because some of the first houses were the custom builds, where that homeowner was, guiding the process more than a builder building something and then selling it.
Okay, so we're on to the 25th, right?
On
Yeah.
to the
And that's gonna
25th.
be 5 o'clock, our regular time.
Yes. I would think so.
Okay. I didn't get too far.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gary.
I'm just thinking about how long it takes to discuss even things like a parking lot, and then I realize